Chapter 5, Section 3, The Ongoing Debate Over Slavery, 1850 to 1856. It was 1850, and Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky was once again trying to save the Union. Clay was one of the country's leading statesmen, spending much of his political career trying to mend sectional differences. His efforts to win passage of the Missouri Compromise in 1820 had earned him the title the Great Compromiser. Now, 30 years later, North and South were once again on the brink of dividing the Union over the issue of slavery. The elderly Clay was tired and ill, but he would make one last effort to hold the country together. The growing divide over slavery. In both the North and South, people had mixed views on slavery. Many moderates in the North accepted slavery where it already existed. They did, however, object to extending slavery into new territories and states, an opinion known as the Free Soil position. More radical abolitionists wanted to end slavery everywhere. Until that happened, many stood ready to help slaves liberate themselves. They did so by establishing a network of secret escape routes and safe houses for runaway slaves that became known as the Underground Railroad. An escaped slave-turned-abolitionist named Harriet Tubman was the best-known conductor on the Underground Railroad. Tubman risked her life many times by returning to the South to guide slaves to freedom in the North. In the South, moderates saw slavery as a necessary evil that would eventually die out as more and more slaves were freed. Southern radicals, however, held that slaves were property, and that limiting the expansion of slavery into new territories deprived Southerners of their property rights. Territorial expansion became the flashpoint on the ongoing debate over slavery. Just how divided the country was became clear in 1846 when President James K. Polk asked Congress for money to negotiate with Mexico for the acquisition of California. David Wilmot, a representative from Pennsylvania, attached an amendment to the funding bill known as the Wilmot Proviso. The amendment would have banned slavery from any territory that the United States might acquire. Wilmot's objective, he said, was to preserve for free white labor a fair country. The Wilmot Proviso passed several times in the House, which had a majority from the North. Its passage was blocked, however, in the Senate, where the South had more senators, and thus more power. The debate over the expansion of slavery was renewed after the United States acquired vast lands in the Southwest in its war with Mexico. Moderates in both the North and South proposed settling these new territories on the basis of popular sovereignty, or rule by the people. This meant allowing voters in the territories to decide whether to permit slavery. But popular sovereignty did not address the problem of keeping a balance of power in Congress if and when these territories became states. This problem came front and center when California applied for admission to the Union as a free state in 1849. California's entry as a free state would tip the balance of power toward the North. Of course, Northerners welcomed this idea, while Southerners strongly opposed it. Congress was deadlocked again, and some Southerners spoke of withdrawing from the Union. A compromise was something for everyone. At this point, Henry Clay stepped forward with a plan known as the Compromise of 1850. Clay's plan had something for everyone. It had admitted California into the Union as a free state, which pleased the North. It divided the rest of the Southwest into two territories, New Mexico and Utah, and opened both to slavery, which pleased the South. It ended the slave trade in Washington, D.C., but allowed existing slaveholders there to keep their slaves, making both sides happy. The Compromise of 1850 also included a strong fugitive slave law. The new law required the return of escaped slaves to their owners, something slaveholders had been demanding for years. All good citizens, it added, are hereby commanded to aid and assist in the prompt and efficient execution of this law. Those who did not could be fined or jailed. To get his plan through Congress, Clay persuaded Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts to lend his support. Webster opposed slavery, but he agreed to support Clay's compromise in an effort to end the crisis. In a speech before Congress, Webster urged his fellow senators to unite for the good of the nation. I wish to speak today not as a Massachusetts man, nor as a Northern man, but as an American, he said. I speak today for the preservation of the Union. The debate went on for months, but Congress finally approved Clay's compromise. The compromise satisfies no one. Clay and Webster hoped the Compromise of 1850 would placate both sides and help ease tensions over slavery. Instead, the compromise pleased almost no one. The fugitive slave law caused particular friction. The law allowed Southern slave catchers to come north to retrieve escaped slaves and required Northerners to come to the aid of these slave catchers or face fines, even imprisonment. Many Northerners felt the law was immoral and refused to obey it. The resistance outraged Southerners. Friction between the sections was further intensified by publication in 1852 of Uncle Tom's Cabin. In this best-selling novel, Harriet Beecher Stowe described the cruelties of slavery through the story of a dignified slave named Uncle Tom. The novel described Tom's experience with 3 slaveholders. 2 of them treat Tom kindly. The third, Simon Legree, abuses Tom and has Tom beaten to death for refusing to tell where 2 escaped slaves are hiding. Stowe hoped her novel would help bring slavery to a quick and peaceful end. Instead, the book increased the hostility of many Northerners toward the South. Southerners, in turn, saw Stowe's description of slavery as both inaccurate and an insult to their way of life. Let the people decide. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. In 1854, another act of Congress set the North and the South on a collision course. That year, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois introduced a bill to organize the Great Plains for settlement. Because this area lay north of the Missouri Compromise line, the bill did not mention slavery. Southerners in Congress agreed to vote for the bill if the 2 new territories, Kansas and Nebraska, were organized on the basis of popular sovereignty. With Southern support, the Kansas-Nebraska Act made it through Congress. The true intent and meaning of this act, it said, was not to legislate slavery into any territory or state, nor to exclude it therefrom. The Kansas-Nebraska Act dismayed many Northerners. They thought the Missouri Compromise had put most of the Great Plains off limits to slavery. Now they feared slavery would spread like a plague across the country. To prevent that from happening, anti-slavery activists and settlers, or free soilers, united to form a new political party in 1854. The new Republican Party took a firm stand against the Fugitive Slave Law and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas becomes a battleground over slavery. By 1855, settlers were pouring into Kansas. Most were peaceful farmers seeking good land to farm, but the territory also attracted agitators or protesters who wanted to influence a vote on slavery. Abolition societies in the North sent in free soilers, while groups in the South recruited pro-slavery settlers to occupy Kansas. It was not long before these 2 opposing camps came into conflict. From Missouri, armed agitators called Border Ruffians crossed into Kansas and threatened the free soilers. On May 21, 1856, pro-slavery forces raided the free soil town of Lawrence, Kansas. They burned buildings, looted stores, and destroyed 2 printing presses. Northern newspapers called the Border Ruffians' rampage the Sack of Lawrence. Anti-slavery activists led by John Brown met violence with violence. Brown was an anti-slavery zealot who had dedicated his life to ending slavery by any means necessary. He urged his followers to fight fire with fire and strike terror in the hearts of the pro-slavery people. 2 days after the Lawrence raid, Brown and 7 of his supporters attacked the pro-slavery town of Potawatomi. They dragged 5 men out of their homes and killed them with their swords. Brown's massacre prompted still more bloodshed in Kansas as pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces battled for control of the territory. But the violence was not restricted to Kansas. It was also infecting the nation's capital. The day after the Lawrence raid, Preston Brooks attacked and beat Charles Sumner on the Senate floor. Despite efforts at compromise, the struggle over slavery was getting more violent.